Today's sermon on our fifth principle is my next step in following through on my intention to do a series of sermons on my interpretation of each of our 7 principles in turn. And I'm beginning to think I might make it to the end. As I've warned you many times before, my only real qualification to speak to you is that I think about stuff a lot. I don't pretend to be an expert on the subjects I'm talking about. I only hope to give you some things to ponder and to stimulate your own thinking. Once again, I'd like to start by going over the principles which are listed in the front of the hymnal. If you want to follow along, you don't have to. We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large, which is what I'll be speaking about today, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all, and respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. I have personally found these principles, taken as a group, to constitute a remarkably complete, self-consistent, and interlocking moral code. These principles were agreed upon by our association, and not handed down as law by a prophet or a deity. Thus, they constitute a living tradition that we can add to or clarify or update as the need arises. As Unitarian Universalists, we don't have a creed, but we do have our principles, which are at the core of what it means to be a UU. And while there's plenty of room for interpretation of their meaning, at least according to our bylaws, a member of our congregation is expected to be in sympathy with these principles. The principles are not a belief system, but a framework around which to build our individual belief systems, or a touchstone against which to test our beliefs. That is, if we find our beliefs to be in conflict with the principles, we probably need to re-examine our belief system. When I first sat down to ponder writing a talk on the 5th principle, I didn't think I'd be able to come up with much that I was qualified to say about it. I actually considered cheating and doing a talk on the 5th and 6th principles combined. But once I realized that not being an expert had never stopped me before, I found that I could come up with plenty to say. The right of conscience and the use of the democratic process could almost be viewed as 2 separate principles, so I'm going to talk about them separately. Begin with the right of conscience. The right of conscience is the right to hold your own moral code and beliefs and to live according to those beliefs. By extension, that includes the right not to have religious or moral beliefs or practices forced on you. While right of conscience is often used with respect to religious beliefs, one's personal belief system can come from religious, philosophical, or cultural sources, or one's own experience, or inspirational teachers, or a combination of all those. Pretty much the list of sources in the front of our hymnal under the principles. For some people, it's easier to fall back on religious dogma than on formulating and evolving their own belief system. But as UUs, harking back to my 4th principle talk, we don't really have that luxury. As far as it applies to what we believe, this right is pretty straightforward. To quote Thomas Jefferson from Notes on the State of Virginia, "Our rulers can have authority over our natural rights only as we have submitted to them. The rights of conscience we never submitted, we could not submit. We are answerable for them to our God. The legitimate powers of government extend to such acts only as are injurious to others. But it does me no injury to say there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg." When it comes to what we practice, though, it gets a whole lot more complicated, because my rights end where yours begin and vice versa. That is, if your right of conscience requires you to do things that are injurious to others, to live in such a way as to violate my right of conscience or my civil rights in general, then we're going to have a problem. In my fourth principle sermon, I talked about the paradox of tolerance, that as a UU, you're free to believe whatever you want, only insofar as it doesn't deny my freedom to do the same. The problem with unfettered freedom of action, like that with absolute tolerance of beliefs, is that it's also a paradox. If your actions interfere with my freedom of action, or vice versa, now I don't have the same freedom, and we're going to need principles or guidelines for resolving those issues. To quote from someone who might be my new favorite philosopher, political philosopher anyway, John Stuart Mill, in his 1866 essay On Liberty, wrote, "No one pretends that actions should be as free as opinions. On the contrary, even opinions lose their immunity when the circumstances in which they are expressed are such as to constitute their expression a positive instigation to some mischievous act. The liberty of the individual must be thus far limited. He must not make himself a nuisance to other people. But if he refrains from molesting others in what concerns them, and merely acts according to his own inclination and judgment in things which concern himself, the same reasons which show that opinion should be free prove also that he should be allowed, without molestation, to carry his opinions into practice at his own cost." As you're well aware, it'd be hard not to be, in recent years the right of conscience has been and is being turned on its head, specifically to assert a right to impose one's own beliefs, usually ascribed to one's religion, on others in ways that are injurious. I'm going to bring up a couple of recent examples, primarily just to show how complicated it can get. First, let's talk about Kim Davis, the Kentucky county clerk who refused to issue same-sex marriage licenses. I am not questioning the sincerity of her religious opposition to same-sex marriage. And in her defense, she did not assume her position expecting that she would be expected to issue same-sex marriage licenses. The Supreme Court decision came after she took office. However, she had at least two honorable courses of action open to her that would have kept her right of conscience intact while not denying others their rights. One, resign her position because she can no longer perform the required duties. Or two, delegate same-sex marriage licenses to one of her employees. Sorry, I can't sign that. Take it to John over there in the corner. It is a matter of record that Ms. Davis has been divorced and remarried 3 times, which is likely at least as sinful in the fundamentalist apostolic denomination she apparently belongs to as is same-sex marriage. I think that in most fundamentalist denominations, as well as in the Catholic Church, remarriage after a divorce is considered adultery. And unlike same-sex marriage, God saw fit to include adultery as a thou shalt not in the 10 Commandments. Her personal reconciliation with that is between her and her God. However, for consistency's sake, she should probably have also denied marriage licenses to anyone previously divorced. Or, for that matter, anyone who insists on eating shellfish or breaking any of the other laws in Leviticus. And I don't recall anyone reporting that that ever happened. Which brings me to irony number 1. I don't think antipathy toward the LGBTQ community really is grounded in religion at all. That it's actually cultural, the product of intolerance of anyone perceived as different. I think religion is just used as a convenient justification. Here's irony number 2. In defending Ms. Davis, Mike Huckabee said, quote, "I'm not willing to spend the next years in tyranny under people who think they can take our freedom and conscience away," close quote. The irony, of course, is that he was defending the right to do exactly that to others. The next one I want to touch on is the Masterpiece Cake Shop case, recently decided in the proprietor's favor in the Supreme Court. As we know, he had refused to provide a wedding cake to a gay couple who then sued under Colorado anti-discrimination laws. Now, and I say this as a full-on supporter of LGBTQ rights, this one isn't as cut and dried as a government functionary refusing to do her lawful duty. There is a very narrow distinction to be made between refusing specifically to support a same-sex wedding because of a sincerely held, if utterly misguided, religious belief, and refusing to serve LGBTQ customers at all. Even though we might find their views abhorrent to ours, I don't think that anyone would seriously consider forcing fundamentalist ministers to perform same-sex weddings, or Catholic priests to perform weddings for divorcees, for that matter. Mm-hmm. So there is a right of conscience line there somewhere, murky as it may be. The Supreme Court case was decided on a very narrow technical scope. Indeed, Justice Kennedy, soon to be retired Justice Kennedy, writing for the majority, said, "It is a general rule that religious and philosophical objections do not allow business owners and other actors in the economy and in society to deny protected persons equal access to goods and services under a neutral and generally applicable public accommodations law." Despite those nice-sounding words, I do need to point out that the LGBTQ community is a protected class under some state laws, including Colorado, but sadly not yet under federal anti-discrimination law. Of course, once again, we can't help but notice that same-sex marriage has been singled out as a Christian issue, while lots of other so-called sins are ignored, leading one to think that maybe, just maybe, the homophobia isn't really religious in origin. The right of conscience is often interpreted by those with strongly held beliefs to include the right not to perform services proscribed by their religion, or even to provide services to those that their religion condemns. The first is a messy area that really depends on this particular circumstances. The second is a pretty clear-cut no-no. I think we'd all agree that a particular doctor with a strong, if again misguided, moral position against abortion should not be required to perform abortions. On the other hand, if that doctor were to say refuse to provide services at all for someone who's ever had an abortion, or even someone who's pro-choice, that would clearly be beyond the pale. And if that doctor is unable to terminate a pregnancy when it's required to save the life of his patient, perhaps that doctor should seek another line of work. There's an interesting article from the Pew Research Center titled "Tensions Between Rights of Conscience and Civil Rights" that I stumbled across online that explores some of these issues in a lot more detail than I have time to go into today. The opening line of the article is, "Should doctors, pharmacists, and other healthcare workers have the right to refuse to provide services that conflict with their religious beliefs?" Like I said, I'm not going to go into it. You can look it up if you want. I believe that the right of conscience follows directly from our fourth principle, which asserts our right to a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. But the limitations of that right lie in that word responsible, and in the realization that your right of conscience doesn't come at the expense of everyone else's. Now I'm going to move on to the second half of the fifth principle, the use of the democratic process. But before I get to that, I'm going to talk a bit about just what democracy and the democratic process are. I promise not to get into how a bill becomes a law. I also don't intend to get into partisan politics beyond the scope of basic human rights, at least. One caveat, though, I do have to admit that from my point of view, our American democratic institutions are under assault and in jeopardy, to the point that it feels a bit surreal to be discussing democracy in the abstract as if these are normal times. That said, I'm going to try, and I'm going to start by defining democracy. We're probably all aware that the word itself comes from a Greek root that translates to rule by the people. And we all probably think it means something like majority wins. But there's a lot more to it than that, of course. In the responsive reading number 594 in our hymnal, the fifth principle is restated as, "We believe that all people should have a voice and a vote about the things which concern them." A democracy is any government in which everybody, and I'm using the word everybody guardedly, is entitled to a voice and a vote. If you stumble across political debates in, say, Facebook comments, Don't call that. Sooner or later, someone will say something about American democracy, and someone else will immediately assert that America is not a democracy, but a constitutional republic, implying that the term democracy only applies to a pure or direct democracy. Well, let's break that down. A republic is a representative democracy. That's the definition of a republic. It's a government in which the citizens elect representatives to make decisions, and both the selection of the representatives, indirectly in some cases, and the process by which they make decisions are democratic in nature. And a constitution is simply a set of rules defining how the government works and what the limits of its powers are. So, America is a representative democracy with a set of bylaws. There are many, many possible variations on a democracy, and the American system is one of them. The Wikipedia article on democracy includes political scientist and Stanford professor Larry Diamond's view that democracy consists of 4 key elements. A political system for choosing and replacing the government through free and fair elections. The active participation of the people as citizens in politics and civic life. Protection of the human rights of all citizens. And a rule of law in which the laws and procedures apply equally to all citizens. I'd add my own observation that freedom of speech, the voice that we are all entitled to, a free press, and a strong public education system are critically important to the success of a democracy, which depends on the participation of an informed citizenry. The roots of our affirmation of the democratic process are in our first and second principles, that every one of us has inherent worth and dignity, and thus deserves a seat at the table, and that our civic affairs should be conducted with justice, equity, and compassion, which is at least the goal of the rule of law. In practice, we don't extend the franchise to everyone, the biggest excluded group being those under 18, whom we consider not yet mature and wise enough to be trusted with the vote. Sometimes noting, for example, that there are 12-year-olds who are wise beyond their years and 60-year-olds who, well, aren't. It's tempting to speculate that we'd be better off if we did have some kind of test or tighter criteria for whether a person should be allowed to vote. But that is, of course, a slippery slope that takes us away from democracy. The advantage of using age as a criterion is that while it may not be fair in every instance, it's an objective measure that's hard to manipulate. Even denying the vote to those with felony convictions can be a subtle tool to selectively suppress the vote of poor people and people of color who are more likely to end up with felony records than well-off white folks who commit the same crimes. Ultimately, to have faith in democracy, one has to have faith in our fellow humans. In a reflection on the 5th principle on the UUA website, excerpted from the book The 7 Principles in Word and Worship, the Reverend Parisa Parsa says that in our religious lives, the democratic process requires trust in the development of each individual conscience, a belief that such development is possible for each of us, as well as a commitment to cultivate our own conscience. She goes on to quote Theodore Parker, "Democracy means not, I am as good as you are, but you are as good as I am." Clearly, there's some humility required. We have to extend the same considerations to our fellow humans as we expect them to extend to us, which, come to think of it, sounds a lot like the Golden Rule. Coffee time. Now, I'm going to talk about the democratic process in our society next, and save in our congregations for last. But I'm going to call this next section Problems of Democracy, which was the name of a civics class I had in 9th grade under a Mr. Sanders, I believe. And I'm going to start with a Winston Churchill quote. "Many forms of government have been tried and will be tried in this world of sin and woe. No one pretends that democracy is perfect or all-wise. Indeed, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time." First, I want to talk about why pure democracy, simple majority rule by the entire electorate, isn't workable, at least for any group larger than a few people. When I was younger, I thought the issue was entirely technical, and that someday, when we were all computer linked, as we pretty much are now, that we would just get up every morning, check the news feed to see what's being voted on, cast our votes, and then head off to work. Do you see what the biggest issue there is? Who decides what's being voted on? Who gets to frame the debate? The whole Byzantine maze of congressional committees and subcommittees and arcane rules, and yes, lobbyists, is all about deciding what sees the light of day to get voted on in the first place. The idea that legislating is about a group of people meeting and debating and changing minds with impassioned speeches on the floor of Congress is a romantic notion, but not very accurate. The other issue with a simple, pure democracy is that unchecked, it inevitably leads to tyranny of the majority. Now that's a term I've heard twisted into a complaint that the majority always gets its way. Well, what it really means is this. Here's a hypothetical example. Let's say the green people are 70% of the country and blue people are only 30%. The green people want the overall tax rate to be 40%, and the blue people want it to be 20%. Compromise? I think not. The tax rate is going to be 40%. Majority wins. But that's not tyranny, it's just overwhelming public sentiment. Tyranny is if the green people decide that the tax rate will be 50% for blue people and 10% for green people. To keep that from happening requires constitutional protections and a principle that requires the law to apply equally to blue and green alike. Now, about the Electoral College we all love to hate, I think some of us hate it for the wrong reasons. The issue is not the two-stage process whereby technically we select electors who then select a president. That's actually become pretty much moot, as the Electoral College process really is just a rubber stamp with virtually all electors voting for the candidate they were committed to. No, the actual problem is with how the electoral votes are apportioned. And I think we've largely forgotten why it is the way it is. It was a result of a grand compromise in the Constitutional Convention to settle the debate over whether representation should be equal for each state or based on population. For Congress, the solution was to do both and have a bicameral legislature. And for presidential electors, 1 per senator, and so 2 per state, plus 1 per congressional district. In the convention, each state got 1 vote, regardless of its population or the size of its delegation, so they had to get the smaller states on board. The Electoral College, despite what I've heard asserted, had nothing to do with protecting rural populations from urban domination. It was all about large states versus small states and getting a constitution approved. Indeed, as of 1790, New York City had a population of about 33,000. But in Virginia, which by the way is bigger than Tullahoma, but not that much bigger, but in Virginia, which had more than double New York's population, the largest city was Richmond with under 4,000. So Virginia had a very rural population, but it was the largest state and the one that everybody else was scared of. Actually, many seeming weirdnesses of American democracy stem from the fact that the states are actually semi-sovereign entities that decided to throw in their lot together and not just subdivided federal districts. Vermont actually didn't join the Union until 1791 and effectively stayed an independent country until then. Because of the apportionment compromise and because the population discrepancies have widened, a California voter currently has about 1/4 the clout in a presidential election as a Wyoming voter. The other issue that can lead to the outcome of a presidential election not reflecting the overall will of the people is that all the states except Maine and Nebraska currently award all their electoral votes to the statewide popular vote winner. So a candidate can win a few large states by slim margins and lose all the rest by large margins and still emerge victorious. But it is up to each state how to assign their electoral votes. And interestingly, there is an initiative underway among a group of states to award their electoral votes to the nationwide popular vote winner, to take effect if and when enough states sign on, namely enough that those states constitute a majority of the electoral votes and thus can guarantee that the nationwide electoral vote. So they're tackling the problem without a constitutional amendment, possibly. Another problem with a democracy is that it's inherently unstable, so it requires constant vigilance to keep it intact. If you ever played the old computer game Civilization, Sid Meier's Civilization more precisely, you already sort of know that. Once you've developed and implemented democracy in the game, your nation can far outpace communist nations, for example. But you had to keep your people happy and avoid major wars, or your government would collapse. It's just a game, a weirdly addictive one, but the point was valid. In times of fear and anger, polarization worsens, and ultimately people will accept authoritarianism if it makes them feel safer and they perceive that it's their side that's winning. I used to assert that if the political spectrum were a football field, the whole of mainstream American politics was played out between the 40-yard lines, never moving too far off center. I miss those days.
You've been running up and down the field, man.
It worked because a large chunk of the electorate were moderates or independents, and both parties had to work to appeal to them. So long as that was true, compromise was a useful tool. Let's say the green folks and the blue folks now are roughly equal. The green folks want the corporate tax rate to be 40%. The blue folks want it to be 20%. Their representatives go off into a meeting and come out agreed on 30%. And none of them look happy, which is how you know they probably got the right answer. By the way, there are things I consider legitimate political issues amenable to compromise that reasonable people can disagree on. But other issues are basic human rights issues that there is no compromising on. If one side says, for example, that we should separate all the children from parents who cross our border fleeing poverty and violence, and the other side says we shouldn't separate any of them, then the first side comes back and says, okay, how about only half of them? That's not the right answer. Even if we ultimately conclude that we cannot grant them asylum, the correct number of children to separate from their parents in the meantime is 0. Other problems. How should we pick our leaders? It's becoming more and more apparent that the skill set required to win elective office is not necessarily the same skill set required to govern effectively. Maybe candidates, not voters, should have to pass some kind of competency test. Indeed, yes. Modern campaigning actually drives polarization, as modern electoral strategy emphasizes maximizing the turnout of the base, the most extreme and passionate supporters of the party, while, if possible, discouraging the other side's base, instead of trying to appeal to the moderates and independents, who, frustrated by the whole process, are less likely to vote anyway. So while you'll hear lip service paid to the need to increase overall turnout, nobody's really doing much about it. In 2016, in the supposed beacon of democracy that is the United States, Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton each got about 30% of the vote, slightly more for Clinton and Trump, of course. While I Don't Care Enough to Go Vote won with about 40%. We really need to find a way to encourage greater participation. And last, but certainly not least, we desperately need campaign finance reform. The Citizens United decision based on the assertion that money equals speech is absolutely absurd. Apparently, the more money you have, the more free speech you're entitled to. So you have the right to drown out my voice. Reminds me of the line from George Orwell's Animal Farm. All animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. It just goes against the whole egalitarian philosophy underlying democracy. Now finally, I'll say a little bit about the use of the democratic process in our congregations. The first thing I'll say is that we walk our talk. Not just our individual congregations, but our UU association are governed by democratic processes. Our governance is a lot more bottom-up than top-down. Indeed, something we have in common with Southern Baptists, one of the few things I suspect, is congregational polity. Each of our congregations makes its own decisions. Our congregation is indeed basically a constitutional republic. Our bylaws are our constitution, and our democratically elected board is empowered to make most decisions on behalf of the congregation. Some more consequential decisions are put to the entire congregation for a vote, of course, and some have a higher threshold than a simple majority. Democracy doesn't always mean simply majority rule. In practice, our congregational elections are usually confirmations in the sense that small organization elections are rarely contested. Our biggest challenge is often finding one candidate to fill a slot, not deciding between two or more. In my 15.5 years on the board of this congregation, which ended just over a week ago, I never had to campaign for my position. I almost had to campaign to get out of it.
Almost.
But if there ever were a reason to contest an election, it's important that the opportunity is there. I've had the privilege to attend 2 General Assemblies as a delegate. It was an eye-opening experience. Democracy in action is very messy, whether it's in Congress or at a UUA General Assembly. The process is complicated and flawed, and yet stuff gets done, and it's all strangely beautiful. At the 2016 GA, the business sessions were moderated by the late, great Jim Key. He made mistakes, people got testy with him, he got testy back, but he kept it all moving and got it done, and I just remember thinking I wouldn't want his job for anything. I remember the same frustration that one of our off-site delegates this year confided to me. It was Charity, of course. Confided, yeah. When a debate seemed to be going on interminably with nothing new being added, thinking, would somebody just call the question already? But I also remember leaving the hall last year thinking, wow, we did a thing. And just feeling that I'd been a part of something important. Ultimately, the best thing about democracy is taking advantage of the freedom to participate in it. So go vote. So just to recap a little, the right of conscience, the right to hold our own beliefs and to live according to them is a good thing, but it gets complicated if it leads to conflict with the right of conscience of others. The right to formulate our own beliefs follows directly from the 4th principle, but so does the responsibility to re-examine those beliefs if they lead us astray. Our affirmation of the use of the democratic process is rooted in the 1st and 2nd principles, which together imply that all people are important and should be treated with dignity and respect, and thus should have a say in matters which concern them. Democracy is complicated in practice, but ultimately it's a simple concept. Decisions affecting a group of people should be made by those people, not imposed from above, and each voting member of the group should have an equal voice in those decisions, even if it's an indirect voice by way of elected representatives. Democratic governments are unstable and must be vigilantly maintained. A healthy democracy requires an informed citizenry, which depends on freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and a strong public education system. Unlike idealistic notions of pure democracy, in practice, the democratic process is very messy, the worst form of government except for all the other forms. Democracy isn't about getting what you want, it's about having a say, but recognizing that your say is no more or no less important than anyone else's. And it's ultimately about respecting the process by agreeing to live with the outcome or working through the democratic process to change it. Like the democratic process, life in general can be messy and confusing sometimes. So, as always, please help each other through it and try to leave the world a little better than you found it. Thanks for listening.